They whispered it behind their hands. The man had married them both, twin sisters, indistinguishable in face, but not in fate. One carried life. The other carried something else. In the cold hills of Tennessee, where the sycamores twist like reaching arms and the air still remembers the dead, the Greer house stood silent, but silence was never empty. Not when one sister refused to die, not when the child born refused to cry, and not when the cradle rocked, though no hand touched it. They say one twin still walks the land. The question is, which one? The preacher's boots sank into the damp clay of the hollow road as he approached the house everyone had stopped speaking about. Rain had turned the yard to mud, but no footprints marked it. The chimney coughed smoke that smelled sweet, like wood and something spoiled. They were waiting on the porch, the man and his brides. He stood between them, Thomas Greer, broad-shouldered and wordless, his eyes set on the preacher with a look that begged no blessing. The sisters wore matching white dresses, though one's hem was stained in red clay. Ruth and Abigail, born 10 minutes apart, now both took the same man's name. The townsfolk had refused to come. Even the preacher, summoned by a trembling letter sealed with a thumbprint of dried blood, had hesitated 3 nights before answering. No law in Tennessee forbade what was happening, but something deeper in the bone did. As he opened his Bible, his hands trembled, not from the chill, but from the way the twins never looked at each other. Ruth stood perfectly still, her gaze soft and hollow, while Abigail's eyes twitched as though they saw something behind her own reflection. When asked to repeat their vows, Ruth spoke with a voice too smooth to be comfortable. Abigail whispered hers like they'd been written in sleep, and Thomas said nothing. He only nodded. The rings were cold iron bands, no music, no family. Just the 3 of them, a preacher with a mouthful of questions, and the wind rattling through the trees like bones in a sack. When the preacher closed the book and mumbled the last rites of union, something moved in the upstairs window. Not a curtain, not a shadow. Something watching. The preacher didn't ask who else was home. He didn't want the answer. As he turned to leave, Ruth smiled. "The house is full now," she said softly. Abigail didn't smile. Her hands had been clenched the entire time, knuckles bloodless. And Thomas? He never blinked. By the time the preacher's horse carried him back to the road, he realized he'd forgotten to ask who was older, Ruth or Abigail. But by then, the question didn't matter. Because whatever order they'd come into this world, only one would leave it. And something else, something older, had just been invited in. The house was too quiet for one with 3 people inside. That was the first thing Thomas noticed when he came down the stairs the morning after the wedding. No pans clattering, no fire crackling. Just the sound of the rocking chair on the porch, tapping faintly against the wood, not from anyone sitting in it, but from the wind, or something like the wind. Ruth stood in the kitchen, her back to him, already dressed in white again. Always white. Her hair was pinned too tightly, her posture too still, as though she had been waiting like that since the night before. Abigail was not downstairs. He did not ask where she was. He poured water from the basin, washed his hands, dried them on a cloth that smelled faintly of copper. Ruth made breakfast but did not eat. She set 2 plates, one for Thomas, one for herself, no third. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Ruth looked up for a moment, and her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Thomas stared at her, as if waiting for her to speak louder, but she just turned and began wiping the counter in slow, circular strokes. When Abigail finally came down, her dress was not white. It was gray, damp at the hem, as if she'd walked through dew before dawn. Her hair was unpinned, tangled. Her eyes were swollen, not from sleep, but the lack of it. She looked at the table and said nothing. Ruth stepped aside without a word. Abigail sat at the plate that had not been set. She ate with her hands. Thomas said nothing. Ruth cleaned the same circle on the counter, again and again, until the wood turned raw beneath the cloth. Later that day, neighbors passed the edge of the Greer property and saw laundry hanging only Ruth's underthings, drying neatly in the breeze. No sign of Abigail's. Children dared each other to walk closer, but stopped short when they saw a figure in the attic window, staring out, unmoving. They couldn't say which twin it was. That night, Thomas lay between them in the big bed that had once belonged to his father. He did not touch either woman. Ruth breathed slow and silent. Abigail's back was turned to both of them, fists clenched beneath her pillow. The wind picked up again, and the rocking chair began tapping softly. One knock, then another, then a third. Thomas's eyes opened. He sat up. Both women remained still. He rose and stepped to the window, but the porch was empty. He looked down at the chair, rocking slowly. On the seat lay something that hadn't been there earlier, a single white ribbon, torn at one end, tied in a perfect noose. When he turned around, both sisters were sitting up in bed, staring at him. Neither had spoken, neither had moved, but the bedsheet between them was wet, soaked through, and not with water. The blood came without warning. It bloomed dark and wide beneath Ruth as she stood over the wash basin, trickling down her inner thighs and pooling beneath her bare feet. She did not cry out. She only looked down at the floor, as if confused by the presence of it, as if it had come from someone else. Abigail found her there, still as a statue, hands resting lightly on the edge of the basin, blood drying against the white of her nightdress, like vines reaching upward. Abigail said nothing at first. She simply watched. Then she stepped closer, placed a cold cloth in Ruth's hands, and turned to leave. But Ruth grabbed her wrist, not hard, but tight enough to stop her. "It's not mine," Ruth said softly. Her voice held no tremble, no shame, only certainty. Abigail's face gave nothing, not surprise, not fear, only that quiet, hollow look that had become her second skin. She pulled free and left the room. Thomas, when he was told, did not come. He had spent the morning sharpening a blade in the barn, metal dragging against whetstone in a steady rhythm, like breath. When he returned to the house, Ruth was already cleaned and dressed, sitting in the parlor with the fire unlit. Abigail was nowhere to be seen. That evening, Ruth stitched a new chemise by the window, needle pricking through fabric in clean, perfect lines. Thomas sat across from her, watching but not seeing. The house smelled faintly of iron. Outside, the wind had died, but the rocking chair moved again, slower this time, as if pushed by something smaller. Ruth looked up from her sewing and asked, "Do you think it was ever alive?" Thomas didn't answer. He didn't ask what she meant. Behind them, the stairs creaked once, then twice. Thomas turned his head, expecting Abigail, but no one came down. The firewood beside the hearth began to crack, not from heat, but from cold. It split with a sound like bone. Ruth laid her sewing aside. "I bled," she said, "but I still feel it." She placed her hand gently over her belly. "It's quiet now, but not gone." Thomas rose slowly and stepped toward her, his face unreadable. He knelt beside her and placed his ear against her stomach. He closed his eyes. For a moment, nothing. Then his brow furrowed. His lips parted slightly. He leaned in closer, and then he flinched. Not far, just a breath, as if something had knocked once from the inside. Ruth smiled. Abigail came down the stairs hours later, dragging a rug that smelled of damp soil and wood smoke. Her dress was wet again. Her feet were bare. When Ruth asked where she had been, Abigail only said, "I was listening." That night, Thomas locked the bedroom door. But they all knew locks don't work when the thing inside the house was already born. The midwife came without being called. She arrived at dusk, her bonnet pinned low and her shawl heavy with the scent of tobacco and old rain. Her name was Alma, and no one in the hollow knew where she lived. She simply appeared when things began to rot too early. She didn't speak as she crossed the threshold, just stared hard at Ruth's belly before casting her eyes to the floor, where no welcome had been laid. Ruth stood at the fireplace, both hands resting over the gentle curve that had not been there a week ago. The blood had stopped. The feeling had not. Abigail stayed upstairs, her door closed, her silence louder than any scream. Thomas offered no greeting. He only pointed to the rocking chair, which had stopped moving the moment Alma arrived. She did not sit. "How many weeks?" she asked. Ruth shrugged. "It's not growing right, not like the others I've seen." Alma stepped close, placed a cold palm on the skin just above the navel, and closed her eyes. Ruth didn't flinch, but Thomas did, watching the midwife's fingers twitch, her shoulders stiffen. "It's not moving," Alma said quietly. "Hasn't for 3 nights." Ruth nodded, "but I still feel it watching." Alma turned sharply toward her. "Watching?" Ruth tilted her head. "In dreams, but not mine. I think it dreams through me." Alma stepped back like the words had teeth. She reached into her satchel, pulling out a bundle of roots, thread, and a single iron nail. "Boil these by moonlight. Bury the water under a gate. If nothing changes by Sunday, burn the cradle." She didn't ask if there was a cradle. She already knew. Ruth opened her mouth to speak, but Alma was already at the door. "Don't let it hear its name," the midwife muttered. "If it hears it, it stays." Thomas followed her outside. "What do you mean, it?" Alma didn't look back. "There's a heartbeat," she said, "but it ain't like ours. I've only heard it once before, long ago, in the hills near Clover Bend. That child never cried, didn't breathe right, but its eyes opened in the womb, and its mother bled from her ears every night till it came." "And the child?" Thomas asked. Alma paused. "The father hung himself 3 days later, and the child was never found. That night, Ruth boiled the roots, but did not bury the water. She poured it into a glass jar and placed it on the windowsill. Abigail came down after midnight, barefoot again, her hair damp, her eyes wrong. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Keeping it thirsty," Ruth answered. Abigail didn't reply. She only looked toward the cradle Thomas had carved from sycamore wood. It sat empty, but the room no longer felt unoccupied. The house had gone still. Even the wind seemed to listen. Thomas carved the cradle from sycamore because the old men in town said it was a holy wood, the kind that warded off worms, rot, and things that shouldn't cling to life. He worked with bare hands and no plan, letting the shape reveal itself, smoothing each curve until it felt more like bone than lumber. Ruth watched from the window every day as the blade traced its slow circles and the shavings curled like pale curls of hair. She never offered to help. She never asked for it, either. She only stared, her hands resting on her belly, where no kicks had come, but the skin still fluttered on its own, like something stretching just beneath. By the 5th evening, the cradle sat finished in the corner of the nursery, swaddled in shadow. No one dared place a blanket in it. No one spoke a name aloud. Ruth stood before it and said nothing. Thomas stood behind her and lit a candle that didn't last the hour. Abigail never entered the nursery, but the door was always cracked open, as if she waited to be invited. Or warned. The cradle creaked on its own the first night, just once. Then again, louder. When Thomas came to check, it was still. But in the dust beneath it, a trail of tiny lines, like finger bones dragging through soot. He told himself mice, but no mouse walked with 5 toes, perfectly spaced. That morning, Ruth began humming a tune no one knew. It had no words, only a low rise and fall, like breathing from another room. Abigail refused breakfast. She sat by the fire, her back to the cradle, hands folded so tightly her knuckles turned blue. Thomas chopped more wood than usual that day. When he returned inside, Ruth was sewing something into a square of cloth. Tiny red X's, stitched so tight they bled into each other. She wouldn't say what it was for. She only pressed the square into his hand and said, "If it cries, don't answer. It doesn't want comfort. It wants to be remembered." That night, Ruth placed the square beneath the cradle. When she stood, she turned to Thomas and whispered, "You only built one." He didn't understand, or he pretended not to. But the next day, he started carving again, not a second cradle, but a small coffin, narrower than a man's forearm. The townsfolk stopped coming by, not because they were afraid, but because the woods between the Greer house and the road had grown strange. Even in daylight, the trees leaned toward the path, as if listening, as if remembering. Inside, the cradle stayed still until midnight. Then it rocked 3 times. Thomas didn't go to it. Ruth didn't move. But Abigail stood just outside the door, her face pale, her eyes locked on the cradle. "You built it wrong," she said softly. You gave it a bed, but it needed a door. The mirror over the stairwell had always belonged to Thomas's mother, an old oval thing framed in dark walnut, so worn it warped the shape of anything that passed it. Ruth had taken to stopping in front of it each morning, smoothing her hair and adjusting her shawl with the kind of reverence most women gave to prayer. But on the sixth morning, when she stepped into its frame, the glass did not catch her. The hallway behind her reflected as it should, the crooked rug, the soft flicker of oil light, but Ruth herself was missing, as if she'd slipped out of the world while her shadow stayed behind. She stared at it a long time before turning away, lips pressed flat. Thomas, passing behind her moments later, caught the tail end of her reflection, still lingering there, even after she'd moved. It blinked. He smashed the mirror that night, claimed it was old, cracked already, that the wood had warped from heat. Abigail didn't argue, but Ruth stood silently beside the broken glass, her bare feet close enough to the shards that Thomas could see a drop of blood forming on her heel. She didn't flinch. Instead, she whispered something, a single word he couldn't catch. Later, when he asked what it was, she only said, "I thought I saw the child, but it wasn't behind me." The next day, Thomas buried the mirror behind the barn, wrapping the glass in thick canvas and binding it with twine soaked in whiskey. As he covered the hole, the wind turned sharp, and the crows in the trees fell silent. Ruth began speaking in her sleep that night. At first, it was just a whisper, breathless and fragmented, but by the second night, her voice changed, deeper, older. She said names no one in the house recognized, names that sounded more like places or wounds than people. Abigail started sleeping on the floor, further from the bed, closer to the door, and the cradle began creaking again, just once per night, always at the same hour. Ruth kept her eyes open now while lying in bed, watching the ceiling with a fixed stare. "It wants to be born," she said, "but not like we understand it." Thomas tried not to listen, tried to hold the world together through simple things, sawing, oiling hinges, counting boards. But the house was beginning to breathe with its own rhythm. Doors that never creaked now groaned as if tired. The clock ticked even when it had not been wound, and the space where the mirror had once hung stayed darker than the rest of the hallway, no matter how many lamps he lit. Abigail avoided it completely. Ruth sometimes stood before the empty wall for long stretches, her hands folded, her lips moving without sound. When Thomas finally asked her what she saw, she answered without turning around. "I'm not sure yet," she said, "but I think it knows I was the wrong twin." The journal was found by accident. Abigail had been looking for candles in the cellar when her hand brushed against a loose plank near the foundation. The wood was cold, swollen with damp, but it gave way when pressed. Behind it, wrapped in a strip of cloth so old it crumbled in her fingers, was a book with no title. The leather cover was cracked, soft at the edges, and the pages inside were the color of old teeth. She didn't tell Ruth she'd found it, not right away. She took it upstairs after midnight, lit a stub of candle, and began to read. The handwriting shifted every few pages, not wildly, but just enough to notice. At first, the entries were mundane: chores, recipes, births. But soon the tone changed. One set of entries spoke often of dreams, of being watched by something small that moved behind walls. The other wrote of cold that settled into the joints, of eyes in the hearth ashes. Both claimed the name Ruth. Neither mentioned Abigail. The deeper she read, the more Abigail felt the air change around her. The candle flickered, even though the windows were shut. Somewhere below, the cradle let out a faint thump, not a creak this time, but the sound of something shifting its weight. She read on. One entry, scrawled in slanted ink, spoke of a child born without crying, eyes wide and unblinking, who left no breath on the mirror. Another, in tighter script, described burying something behind the sycamore trees, then waking to find it in the cradle again. Abigail's breath caught. She turned to the last page. The ink was fresh, wet even. Her name was there, written plainly, twice. One line read, "Abigail watched me die." The next, "Abigail never left." She dropped the journal. It struck the floor with a soft, meaty sound, like a body landing on cloth. She backed away, heart racing, but didn't scream. Ruth's voice came from behind the door. "It's not meant for you." Abigail turned, her hand already on the latch. "You wrote this?" she whispered. Ruth didn't answer. But when Abigail opened the door, no one was in the hall. Only the sound of dripping, slow, deliberate, like water from a rusted pipe. She looked down, red, a trail leading toward the nursery. She followed it without thought, barefoot, candle trembling in her hand. The door to the cradle room was open. Inside, the cradle rocked gently. No child, no wind, just the slow sway of wood against wood. On the floor beside it, another journal, open to a page she hadn't seen. Her name again, this time with a new line beneath it. "One of us has to be the mother." The candle went out. The cradle stopped, and Abigail, for the first time in years, began to pray. The house had not known silence like this before, not even in the dead of night, when the wind usually threaded through the shutters or the mice scratched faint hymns behind the walls. This silence came with weight. It pressed on the chest, curled behind the eyes. Ruth hadn't moved from her chair in 2 days. She no longer sewed or hummed. She sat with her hands crossed over her belly, eyes fixed on the far wall, as if waiting for it to bleed. Abigail paced the upstairs hallway, barefoot, muttering to herself names neither sister remembered being taught. Thomas stayed mostly in the barn now, pretending to repair tools that didn't need fixing. He could feel the house watching him. Even the chickens wouldn't come near the porch. On the third day, Ruth finally spoke. She looked down at her stomach and said, "It stopped." No one asked what she meant. Abigail went pale. Thomas stood at the doorway like a man too afraid to step into a church he no longer believed in. "No heartbeat," Ruth said. "No flutter. It just quieted." Thomas stepped forward. "Sometimes they settle. Sometimes it's nothing." Ruth tilted her head. "Then why do I still feel it in the cradle?" That night, Abigail heard the lullaby again, the same one Ruth used to hum, only slower, stretched thin like breath, trying to carry a dying song. But it wasn't coming from Ruth's room. It was coming from the floorboards beneath her own bed. She did not scream. Screaming had become useless in this house. She pressed her hands to her ears and waited until the song faded. In the morning, Ruth was gone. Not from the house, but from herself. She sat on the edge of the porch, her nightdress soaked with dew, eyes rimmed in red. When Abigail touched her shoulder, she whispered, "I saw it. It was never inside me." "Not really." Abigail pulled her close, but Ruth resisted. "It lives in this house. I was just its doorway." Thomas found them like that, one twin clinging to the other, but neither able to offer warmth. He stepped past them and into the nursery. The cradle had turned itself toward the window. On the wall above it, written in what looked like rust or dried blood, were the words, "Tell it no stories." He backed out slowly. That night, all three of them slept in separate rooms. Ruth did not close her door. Abigail locked hers twice. Thomas slept with a Bible beneath his pillow. But none of it mattered. At 3 in the morning, the cradle creaked once, then again, then once more. Ruth sat up in bed. Her hands moved slowly to her belly. Her skin was flat, hollow. She began to hum, but this time the tune was not hers. Blood dripped from the ceiling in the preacher's room. It fell slow and steady, dotting the open pages of his Bible, landing between psalms and promises, smearing the word mercy until it read more like memory. He looked up, eyes heavy with sleep and disbelief, expecting a leak or an animal caught in the rafters. But the boards were dry. There was no smell of rot, only the blood, warm and red, falling without source. He did not call for help. He did not pray. He simply closed the Bible, wiped the page with a cloth, and folded his hands. The letter had arrived 2 days ago, penned by a hand he did not recognize, but sealed with the same thumbprint of dried blood he'd seen once before. No name. No request, just 5 words. Come. The child is listening. He knew it meant the Greer house. He knew he would go. That afternoon, he passed through the hollow, where no birds sang and no wind moved the branches. The road had narrowed since his last visit, as if the land itself was closing its throat. The house looked the same still, upright, breathing slow beneath the skin of its wooden bones. But something hung in the air now, a heaviness, as if the house had been fed. Ruth answered the door. Her eyes were glassy, her voice calm. "We didn't call for you." The preacher nodded. "I know." Abigail stood behind her, pale and silent. She did not move, but her lips were wet with red, not blood, not paint, something older. Thomas was not seen. The preacher stepped inside. The cradle rocked gently in the nursery, though no one had touched it. He passed the stairs and saw the cracked mirror had returned not whole, but pieced back together, fragments held in place with black wax. His own reflection blinked before he did. Ruth offered him tea. He refused. "The child," he said. "Where is it?" Ruth looked toward the nursery. "It's resting. It doesn't like light." "Was it born?" he asked. Abigail answered. "It never needed to be." That night, the preacher slept in the back room again, though he never closed his eyes. The blood from the ceiling did not return, but something else came. 3 knocks, then silence. Then, breathing not human, not animal, just the low rasp of something trying to remember how lungs work. The preacher rose, walked to the window, and looked toward the trees. Something moved between them, small, crawling, as if limbs had learned to bend the wrong way. In the cradle room, the lullaby hummed without a mouth to carry it. The preacher did not enter. He only whispered, "God forgive the womb that opened." But the house had no use for forgiveness, only memory, only birth. Ruth gave birth in silence. There were no cries, no screams, no midwife, just the slow unraveling of breath from her mouth as the thing came forward, inch by inch, like it had been waiting for this moment long before she was ever born. Abigail stood in the corner of the room, hands trembling, lips moving in prayer or curses. She couldn't tell anymore. The sheets were stained black, not red, not fresh, as if the blood had already aged, dried, and come back again. Ruth did not weep. Her face was blank, pale, her eyes unfocused, and when it was over, there was nothing, no sound, no motion. Just the weight of something unseen settling over the house like dusk. The cradle remained untouched, though Ruth's arms were empty. Abigail moved forward, slowly, as if crossing a graveyard at midnight. She reached down to wrap the thing in cloth, but her hands stopped before they touched it. Her fingers hovered in the air, unsure whether they were meant to swaddle or bury. "It's not dead," Ruth said flatly. "It just doesn't like breathing." Abigail knelt anyway, her throat tight. The figure on the bed was small, still, pale as ash. The skin was smooth, but cold, and where the eyes should have been, there was only thin, papery skin, like eyelids stretched across hollow sockets. The mouth was sealed, sewn shut. Thomas came in then, and his face collapsed. He did not ask if it was alive. He did not speak at all. He simply took a step back and pressed his hand to the wall, steadying himself like the house had tilted beneath his feet. Ruth stared at the cradle. "It won't rest there. It says, that's for the next one." Abigail dropped the cloth. "The next?" Ruth turned her head slowly. "You think it came alone?" That night, they buried it behind the sycamores, or at least tried to. The ground refused to take it. No matter how deep Thomas dug, the dirt remained shallow, soft, as if something beneath it was breathing out. They left the bundle anyway, wrapped in Ruth's bloodied nightgown, weighted with stones that floated in water but sank into the earth. The next morning, the cradle rocked. Ruth never entered the nursery again. Abigail did, but only once to find the bundle returned, resting softly in the cradle, still swaddled, untouched by soil. But now its eyelids were gone, and the cradle was warm. Abigail backed out, her hand over her mouth. In the hallway, the broken mirror flickered. Her reflection smiled at her, but she hadn't. And from inside the nursery, the sound of something sucking in air for the very first time echoed through the boards. One breath, then none, then one again, like something remembering how to be born. The cradle began to rock on its own by the second night, slow and steady, as if moved by a hand too old to tire and too cold to shake. No one touched it. No one dared. Ruth hadn't spoken since the burial that did take. She sat by the window now, day and night, her face thin and distant, lips parted slightly like she was listening to something just beyond the room. Abigail tried to speak to her, but Ruth's replies were fragments. "It knows," he promised. "We were only the vessel," phrases that looped without end, as if she were repeating something taught in sleep. The cradle creaked at dusk and again at dawn. Sometimes it stopped when watched, but more often it didn't care. One morning, Thomas nailed it to the floor. He used 6 nails, thick and long, iron-heated black, before driving them into the wood with a mallet. The sound rang through the house like a warning. Ruth watched from the hall. She did not blink. That night, the cradle did not move. Not at first, but by the time the hour reached near midnight, a scratching began, not from beneath, but from inside. A soft clawing, like a cat in a box. Then a sudden jerk, a jolt so sharp, one of the nails snapped clean in half. The cradle turned slightly to face the window, though no one had touched it. In the morning, Thomas found the broken nail lying in the fireplace ash. He had not put it there. Abigail gathered her shawl and left the house for the first time in days, walking all the way to the far pasture, where she stood beneath the sycamore trees and stared at the soil. It had sunk, just slightly, as if something had pressed up from underneath in the night. She knelt to touch it, fingers trembling. The ground pulsed. Once, she stood and ran. When she returned, Ruth was humming again. A low, tuneless sound that did not rise or fall. It vibrated the walls, made the windows sweat. "It's almost finished," she said. "The rocking is only the beginning." That evening, Abigail dreamed of a second cradle. This one was black, carved not from wood but from bone, and it hung from the rafters by ropes made of hair. Inside it was a mouth, just a mouth, wide and wet and hungry. When she awoke, her own pillow was soaked, but not with sweat. Something warm, something red. She didn't check for cuts. She already knew it wasn't hers. In the hallway, the mirror's surface had gone dark again. The glass no longer showed the house, only the cradle, and within it the smallest shape, moving, smiling, not yet a child, not any more a secret, just waiting. Abigail found her sister lying in the bath with her eyes open and her skin cold. Though the water still steamed, Ruth had not spoken since the rocking returned, and for a moment, Abigail believed she was dead until Ruth blinked, slowly, once, then again. Abigail knelt beside the tub, heart hammering, and whispered her name. Ruth did not look at her. She only said, "It told me its name." The words were quiet, flat, spoken like reciting a riddle already solved. Abigail gripped the rim of the tub. "Don't say it. Don't ever speak it." Ruth turned her head, neck moving stiffly like bone too long still. Her mouth formed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't. I only listened." That night, her skin began to change. It started at her fingertips, pale to blue, soft to wax. She walked barefoot through the house, silent as fog. Her breath clouded in the air even when the fire burned hot. Thomas stood in the hallway and watched her pass. "Where were you?" he asked, though he didn't know why. Ruth looked at him like he was a question no longer worth answering. "It's closer now. I feel it behind my eyes." She raised a hand and tapped lightly against her temple, like a foot pressing against the inside of a wall. Thomas stepped back. Ruth kept walking. The next morning, she did not rise. Her body lay curled in bed, hands folded neatly, skin pale and smooth. Abigail tried to shake her awake, but found her flesh colder than snowmelt. She began to cry, but then Ruth's eyes opened, slowly, and when they did, they were not her eyes. The color had drained from the irises, leaving a soft milk gray. Her pupils were wide and unblinking, and when she spoke, it was not her voice. "Why are you weeping?" it said through her mouth. "I haven't even come yet." Abigail stumbled back, gasping, her fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. Ruth sat up with the stiffness of a doll, every joint cracking. She looked around the room like it was unfamiliar. It was her body, she said. But she never really lived in it, did she? Abigail did not answer. She couldn't. Her voice was gone, swallowed by the horror settling thick in her throat. That evening, Thomas buried a knife under Ruth's pillow, a charm his mother had taught him for keeping the dead from speaking. But Ruth didn't seem to mind. She only tucked it beside her, like a gift from an old friend. The cradle rocked again. This time, without stopping, it moved all through the night, in slow rhythm, never squeaking, never faltering. And in the dark, Ruth whispered to herself or to something inside her. I was only the wrapper, she said. She was always the gift. The quilt appeared on the line before dawn, flapping gently in the windless air, its edges twitching like breath. No one remembered hanging it there. Abigail found it first. She stepped onto the porch barefoot, drawn by something sharp in the back of her throat. Not smoke, not sickness, but the taste of old copper. The quilt swayed, stitched in Ruth's hand, but she didn't recall Ruth ever sewing this one. It was all white, save for a pattern repeated in red thread. A row of tiny symbols, crooked X's, inverted trees, eyes sewn shut, and one phrase, looped in uneven cursive across the border again and again. The wrong twin lived. Abigail did not touch it. She backed away slowly, her mouth dry, her eyes burning with something she didn't dare call tears. Behind her, the house shifted, the wooden boards creaking, not from age but like lungs drawing in breath. Ruth had not come downstairs in 2 days. She no longer responded to knocks or meals or prayers. But that morning, the bedroom door stood wide open, and the air beyond it was ice. Thomas entered first. The room was dark, though both windows faced the rising Sunday. The curtains had been torn down and stuffed beneath the bed. Ruth sat in the rocking chair beside the cradle, unmoving. Her eyes were closed, her face too calm. Her hands rested on her lap, one holding a length of red thread that disappeared into her mouth. She had sewn it into her tongue. Thomas stepped forward, gag rising in his throat. He called her name, once, then again. No answer. Abigail reached to touch her, but Ruth's eyes opened before she could. Wide, hollow, pale as milk. Abigail froze. Why? She asked. Ruth didn't move her lips, but a voice came anyway, low and far away, like a child whispering into a bottle. She wanted to be remembered, so I gave her a story. Ruth lifted her hand and placed the thread into the cradle. It vanished the moment it touched the sheets, pulled downward, like caught by fingers. The cradle creaked once, then again, and then, from within the folds of the blanket, something shifted. Abigail stepped back. Thomas grabbed her wrist. It's not hers, he said. It never was. That night, the quilt was gone from the line. In its place, the clothesline hung slack, a single clothespin spinning slowly in a wind no one felt. Abigail did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a candle burning low, the air heavy with a scent she hadn't smelled since childhood milk left too long on the stove. Upstairs, Ruth hummed, but the tune was wrong, too slow, too deep, and every third note matched the sound of something rocking, something learning, something remembering how to be born. The first time Abigail saw Ruth digging, it was just past 3 in the morning. The moon hung low and red above the sycamores, casting a sickly glow across the yard. Ruth moved slow, methodical, her white nightdress soaked through at the hem with dew and something darker. She had no lantern, no shoes, just her bare hands and a rusted spade she must have taken from the barn. Abigail watched from the attic window, heart tight in her throat, unable to look away. Ruth wasn't digging a grave. Not exactly. The holes were too small, too shallow, too precise, each no wider than a dinner plate, and just deep enough for something to rest or be hidden. When Abigail finally came outside, she kept her steps soft. Ruth did not turn. She crouched by the fifth hole now, dirt caking her fingers, lips moving in silence. Abigail stood a few feet back. "What are you burying?" she asked. Ruth didn't stop digging. "Not burying," she said. "Planting." Abigail stared at the line of disturbed earth, each hole perfectly spaced in a crescent arc. What kind of seeds? Ruth looked over her shoulder. Names. Abigail stepped back. What names? Ours. The ones we would have had if we were born different. She scooped more dirt with her hands and whispered, if we were born right. Abigail opened her mouth, then shut it. She wanted to scream, to shake Ruth, to drag her back inside. But the trees leaned in too close, and the soil under her feet felt wrong, soft and warm, like it had been turned from below. Ruth placed something into the next hole, a small bundle wrapped in linen, tied with red thread. It pulsed once, faintly, like breath caught in cloth. Abigail choked back a sound and turned away. You don't understand, Ruth said. It doesn't want to hurt us. It wants to belong. It keeps looking for a door. So I'm giving it roots, Abigail whispered. You're losing yourself. Ruth laughed, but it wasn't her laugh. It was too young, too light, like it belonged to a child who hadn't yet learned sorrow. I already did. I think it took my shape like a coat. And now it wears me better than I ever wore myself. She patted the earth flat with her palm and moved to the next hole. Abigail couldn't watch any more. She ran. Inside the house, the cradle sat still, but something was humming from beneath the floorboards, the same lullaby from the nursery, now layered with a second voice, higher, hungrier. In the morning, the holes were filled and smoothed clean. No sign of digging, no linen bundles. But the sycamores had leaned further overnight, bending inward, their branches arched like hands in prayer or warning. And from the attic window, Ruth watched the wind pass through them. But she did not blink. It was in his tea. Thomas had taken the cup without thought, the same way he had every morning since the world began, turning slower in that house. The fire hadn't yet caught, and the windows bled pale light across the floorboards. Abigail was still upstairs, and Ruth had not left her room in nearly 2 days. He sat at the kitchen table, bone-tired, staring into the steam, pretending for a moment that things could still be ordinary, that the cradle was just wood, that the mirror didn't show things twice, that the child they buried had stayed where they put it. The first sip scalded his tongue. The second brought something between his teeth. At first, he thought it was a tea leaf, maybe a splinter from the kettle, but when he spit it into his palm, his heart clenched. It was a tooth. Tiny, white, smooth, except for the root, which was stained faintly pink, too small for an adult, too fresh for a fossil, too sharp to be forgotten. He dropped it, and it rolled across the table like a marble, clicking to a stop at the edge of Ruth's empty chair. For a long moment, he just stared at it, then rose, quietly, and went to the staircase. Halfway up, he heard it not footsteps, not voices, but the soft, unmistakable sound of something being chewed behind a door, wet, deliberate, steady. He pressed his ear to Ruth's room. Silence. He tried Abigail's. More silence. But when he turned to the nursery, the air shifted. The door stood ajar, though he was certain he'd shut it the night before. Inside, the cradle rocked, not violently, not slowly, just enough to speak without words. Thomas stepped in. The window was open. A breeze moved through the room, though the trees outside were still. The blankets were folded neatly. On the floor beside the cradle, a pile of salt, a ring around it, broken in one place. He knelt. There, pressed into the space where the salt had been disturbed, were the outlines of a handprint, small but not infant. 5 fingers, no nails, at the center of the print, another tooth. This one, black at the tip. Behind him, a floorboard groaned. He turned, expecting Abigail, maybe Ruth. But no one was there. Only the mirror across the hall, which he had broken twice now and still found reassembled each time. In it, he saw himself and a second figure standing just behind his shoulder, pale, mouthless, holding something that dripped. He spun, but the hallway was empty. When he turned back, his reflection smiled, but he didn't. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with the tooth in his palm, afraid to close his fingers, afraid to let it go. Upstairs, Ruth hummed again, this time sweet and low. like she was soothing something older than grief. And in the nursery, the cradle stopped, but only for a breath. Then it began to rock faster. The crying began at exactly midnight, not the wail of a newborn, not the sharp, gasping sobs of a child in pain, but a low, steady moan, like something remembering how to weep. It filled the house with a pressure that made the walls sweat and the floorboards groan beneath their own weight. Abigail sat upright in bed, her hands clenched over her chest, the sound vibrating through her bones before it ever reached her ears. She knew the cradle had started again, but this time it wasn't alone. The moaning came with footsteps, soft, uneven, padding across the nursery floor. Then down the hall, then back again, as though something were learning the shape of the house, mapping it, claiming it. Abigail rose and crept into the hallway. The door to the nursery was open, wider than usual, just enough for the lamplight to catch the edge of the cradle. It wasn't rocking, it was shaking, back and forth, harder now, as if whatever lay inside was either cold or angry. She stepped closer. No sound from inside the room, just that rhythmic creaking and the crying that never changed pitch, as if the voice were stuck on a single note of sorrow. When she reached the threshold, the sound stopped. The cradle went still, and the air turned thick, like walking into a room filled with wet cloth. Abigail's breath caught. She stepped forward anyway. Empty. The cradle was empty. The blankets folded, the pillow undisturbed. But the room did not feel empty. Something had been here. Something still was. Then the crying began again behind her, down the stairs. In the kitchen, she ran, feet slapping the wood, heart hammering. But when she reached the bottom, it stopped once more. The fire was out. The window over the sink stood open, and the curtains fluttered as though something had just passed through them. On the table sat a glass jar. Inside, a single lock of dark hair floated in cloudy water, tied with red thread. Abigail backed away slowly, only to feel a sudden pressure against her spine, not a push, but the weight of a hand resting there, not firm, not angry, just present. She turned, but no one stood behind her. That night, no one in the house slept. The crying returned every hour, always beginning in one room, always ending in another. At dawn, Ruth descended the stairs barefoot, her hair hanging loose, her lips cracked and bleeding. "It's teething," she said, voice raw. "It doesn't like silence. It only rests when it hears us moving." She poured salt across the doorframe, line trembling with each shake of her hand. "Keep the rooms noisy," she whispered. "Walk, rock chairs, rattle cups. Do not let it feel forgotten." From upstairs, the cradle creaked once more, not as a lullaby, but as a warning. Something had learned their rhythms, and it did not want to be alone. The day Abigail found Ruth's body, the sun was high, but the light came in wrong, as if filtered through water, pale and bent. The bedroom door stood open, and the smell hit first. Not rot, not death, something stranger, like milk gone sour in a cradle, or the breath of something that had slept too long and woken starving. Ruth lay atop the bed covers, stiff and curled, her arms wrapped around her chest like she'd tried to hold something in. Her skin was too smooth, too pale, stretched tight as paper across her face. Her lips were parted, as if still whispering, but the breath was long gone. Thomas was in the barn when Abigail screamed. He ran fast, but not fast enough. By the time he reached the room, Abigail had backed into the corner, eyes wide, her dress soaked in whatever liquid had pooled beneath the bed. The cradle sat at the foot of the bed now. No one had moved it there. No one had touched it. The mirror beside the dresser reflected three shapes, two standing, one seated, but only two bodies were in the room. Abigail pointed at Ruth's corpse. "She died. I saw her die." Thomas said nothing. He walked slowly to the window and looked out at the sycamore trees. They leaned closer than before. Their branches trembled, though the air was still. "She died before," he said quietly, "but she didn't stay gone." Abigail looked back to the bed. Ruth's eyes were still open, but something behind them had vanished, as if the soul had been traded out and the husk left behind as payment. They buried her again that evening in the same place behind the house, near the line of shallow holes Ruth had once dug under moonlight. This time, Thomas built a box. Pine. No carvings. Just 6 nails, driven in clean, no prayer spoken. When the last shovel of dirt fell, the wind picked up. Not cold, warm, wet, like breath exhaled from deep beneath the earth. They walked back to the house in silence, boots heavy with mud, eyes refusing to meet. But when they reached the porch, Abigail froze. The front door was open, and standing in the doorway was Ruth. She wore the same white nightdress. Her hands were clean, her hair combed. She smiled like a woman, welcoming guests to a supper table. "You took the wrong one," she said. Her voice was soft, but it echoed across the yard like thunder whispered through cloth. Thomas dropped his lantern. Abigail fell to her knees. Ruth stepped backward into the house, slow and weightless, and the door swung shut behind her without a sound. From upstairs, the cradle creaked once, then again, then rocked, as if it held not a child, but a memory refusing to die. The fire started in the nursery, though nothing burned. Thomas had been sitting by the hearth, carving without thought, the handle of a broken tool, slowly turning into something else under his knife. Abigail had gone to fetch water from the spring, her shoulders tight with the feeling that something was following just out of view. When the heat rose, it came without smoke, only light, flickering orange and red against the ceiling, casting long, twisting shadows down the hallway. Thomas smelled it first, that scorched sweetness, like sugar left too long in a hot pan. When he opened the nursery door, the walls glowed like embers. Not a single flame licked the floorboards, but the air shimmered with heat. The cradle sat untouched in the center of the room, but the wallpaper behind it had blackened, forming the shape of 2 outstretched hands, palms pressed outward, fingers long and smudged, like ash caught mid-reach. Ruth stood in the far corner, or something that still wore Ruth's shape. Her nightdress fluttered in a breeze that didn't touch anything else. Her mouth moved soundlessly, lips forming a lullaby that filled the room, even though no sound passed from her throat. Thomas stepped back, heart hammering. "What are you?" he asked. Ruth turned to him, slow and measured, like a doll lifted by invisible string. "Still me," she whispered, "just rewritten." Behind her, the rocking began, but it wasn't the cradle this time. The floorboards themselves bent with the motion, the entire room pulsing like a heartbeat around them. Abigail burst into the house, bucket dropped by the door. She reached Thomas, just as he staggered backward into the hallway, his eyes wide with something between awe and terror. "It's speaking to her," he gasped. Not with words, with heat. They turned together toward the nursery, but the doorway was gone. The wood had closed up, smooth as untouched wall. Only the faint outline of the frame remained, glowing faintly red like iron, left too close to flame. Abigail pressed her palm against it and jerked back. Blisters formed instantly. Upstairs, the lullaby changed pitch. It became layered. Ruth's voice humming in unison with something smaller, something that chirped and clicked, as though lungs were trying to learn music for the first time. The wallpaper behind the hands peeled slowly, curling inward, revealing beneath it a new layer. Dozens of names scratched into the wood. Some were old, some were Abigail's, some hadn't yet been given. That night, the light faded on its own. The door returned by morning. The nursery smelled of scorched honey, but nothing had burned. Nothing was out of place. Except the cradle, which now hung slightly off-kilter, like one of its legs had grown too short. Inside it, a single burnt feather. Abigail stared at it a long time before whispering, "We never had birds in this house." Thomas replied, "We do now." And in the corner, the ash prints of hands were already fading. By the end of the week, no one in town spoke the Greyer name. Not in church, not in markets, not even in whispers over fences. Mothers tugged their children inside when they wandered too close to the edge of the woods. Dogs refused to take the path near the sycamores. And at night, the wind carried something new. Not a howl, not a cry, but a kind of lullaby sung in a voice that sounded almost human. Almost. Sheriff Merrick rode out once, asked questions with his hat in hand and his gun loose on his hip. Thomas met him at the edge of the porch. Ruth watched from the window with her hands pressed flat against the glass, though she hadn't moved in hours. The sheriff asked about the fire. Thomas said there hadn't been one. He asked about the grave behind the house. Thomas said they'd buried a deer. He asked about the noise the neighbors claimed they heard, the crying, the humming, the knocking. Thomas said it was the wind and nothing more. Sheriff Merrick nodded like he believed it, but his eyes flicked to the rocking chair on the porch. It was moving, slowly, no breeze, no weight. Just motion, steady and without purpose. When he stepped forward to still it, the wood snapped. One leg splintered without pressure, dropping the chair sideways. Inside the house, something thudded hard against the wall, like a body thrown from the cradle. The sheriff left without saying another word. The town buried the Grayers that day, not in the ground, but in conversation. Their name was removed from church ledgers. Their land was scratched from the maps. Children were told the house had burned, even though its chimney still smoked. The pastor refused to pass that way again. He claimed the trees along the path had changed, that they bent too far inward, like they were growing teeth. Back at the house, Ruth hadn't blinked in 2 days. Her skin had taken on the thin translucence of candle wax. Abigail swore she could see something moving just beneath it, like veins, pulling in the wrong direction. Thomas no longer slept. He sat in the hallway with his back against the wall, a lantern burning low, staring at the door to the nursery. "It watches through her," he whispered once. "It sees me clearer than she ever did." Abigail asked him what it wanted. He didn't answer. The next morning, a cross was found, burned into the grass behind the barn, not placed, not carved, but burned, like something had pressed it into the earth from above. No one touched it. No one prayed over it. And when Ruth finally stood up from the window, she turned to Abigail with a quiet smile and said, "It's almost time to name it." Abigail felt her breath stop, not because of the words, but because she knew, deep in her marrow, they were already too late. They held a funeral without a body, no casket, no preacher, just a square of dirt near the sycamores, freshly turned and flattened, the soil too soft for its own season. Abigail placed a folded scrap of linen into the whole part of the blanket Ruth had bled into, the one they had tried to burn but which refused to catch. Thomas stood behind her, arms at his sides, face unreadable. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of milk and iron, thick as breath on cold glass. He said nothing. Abigail didn't ask him to. She knelt, whispering words she'd once known as prayer, but now barely resembled mercy. The grave wasn't for Ruth, or for the child. It wasn't even for the name that had started forming on the walls, traced in condensation and ash. It was for the forgetting, for the silence they could no longer keep. When she stood, the earth pulsed beneath her boots just once, like something turning over in sleep. She backed away slowly. That night, the cradle did not rock. The house went still, as if holding its breath. Even the floorboards stayed silent. Abigail dared to hope, just for a moment, that whatever had been crawling toward birth had passed. That grief had been enough to starve it. But just before dawn, she heard it. A laugh. Not cruel, not joyful, just new. A laugh that didn't know the weight of sound yet. It came from the nursery. She rose without dressing, walked barefoot through the hall. Thomas was already at the door, his face pale and wet with sweat. He had heard it too. They opened the door together. The cradle sat perfectly still. No blanket, no bundle, only a mark scorched into the bottom of the wood, a spiral, drawn with something sharp, something hot. In the corner of the room, the broken mirror had fallen from the wall. Its shards pointed outward like a flower, and in each piece, a different image. Ruth smiling, Ruth screaming, Ruth staring with eyes that weren't hers. Abigail turned away. Her eyes had begun to sting. The air carried a new sound, now faint breathing, steady and rhythmic, coming from beneath the floorboards. Not footsteps, not scratching, just breathing. Deep and even, like lungs the size of a house had finally filled. She pressed her ear to the floor. Thomas tried to pull her back, but she hissed, "Listen." For a long time, he did. Then he nodded once and whispered, It was never in the cradle. From outside, a branch snapped. The trees were leaning further now, bending so far inward they nearly touched at the tops. The house no longer looked like part of the land. It looked like something the land was trying to bury. And the grave they dug that morning was already open again, soil scattered like something had clawed its way up or been pulled. It began with the silence, not the usual stillness that settled over the house in the dead hours of night, but a deeper, quiet one that rang in the ears, pressed on the chest, made the heart beat louder than breath. Even the trees had stopped moving. Abigail awoke to it. The absence, the kind of quiet that only comes after something has decided it no longer needs to hide. She sat up, instinct screaming that something had changed. The air was thick and sweet, like flowers blooming out of season, like rot dressed in perfume. Down the hallway, the nursery door stood open, just a sliver. But it had been locked the night before. She stepped out of her room barefoot, the floor cold against her soles, the boards beneath her toes somehow softer than they had ever been, like the house itself had softened, ready to give. Ruth's voice came from the bottom of the stairs, not a whisper, not a song, just a single word, spoken in a voice too steady to be hers. "Listen." Abigail froze. She hadn't heard Ruth speak since the burial. Since the door slammed shut behind her, she looked toward Thomas's room empty, his bed untouched. A trail of wet footprints led away from it, curving down the hall toward the nursery. But they were too small to be his, and too many. She descended the stairs slowly. Ruth stood in the parlor, facing the fireless hearth, arms limp at her sides. Her hair hung wet, though there'd been no rain. Her skin was almost translucent now, veins beneath pulsing with something darker than blood. Abigail stepped closer, but Ruth didn't turn. She just said, "It remembered the womb, so it rebuilt one." Then she moved, one slow step toward the wall. She raised her hand and pressed it against the wallpaper, which peeled back under her palm like wet parchment. Beneath it, another layer soft and pink, like skin. Veined, warm, alive. Abigail staggered back, bile rising in her throat. Thomas's voice echoed faintly from the nursery upstairs. "Abigail." She turned, but the voice was wrong, hollow, stretched thin, like it had traveled too far to sound right. She ran up the stairs two at a time. The nursery door was wide now. Inside, the cradle was gone. In its place sat a hollow, dug deep into the floor, lined with cloth, filled with milk-soaked blankets and threads of hair. Thomas knelt at the edge, staring down. "It called me," he said. "It needs a father now." Abigail screamed. Not out of fear, but out of fury. "It's not a child." Thomas turned. His eyes were white. "It never was, but it's becoming one." Behind him, something reached from the hollow, small, pale, smiling. Abigail stepped back. The house exhaled, and everything that had been buried began to hum. The humming didn't stop. It vibrated through the beams of the house, low and pulsing, like the thrum of bees in a hive too deep to see. Every object in the nursery had begun to shift tiny movements, almost imperceptible, but constant. The wooden blocks Ruth once carved, with letters now bore symbols no one had taught them. The wallpaper pulsed, in and out, like lungs. The floor was warm beneath Abigail's feet, and every breath she took felt like it belonged to someone else. Thomas hadn't moved from the edge of the hollow. His hands were slick with something thick and white, and he stared down with the awe of a man witnessing creation or destruction, perhaps both. Abigail didn't ask what he saw. She already knew the answer. The cradle had not been a vessel. It had been an offering. "It's almost done," Thomas whispered, eyes wide, smile twitching. "It just needed names, and we gave it ours." Abigail backed away slowly. The walls seemed to lean with her, stretching slightly, as if trying to keep her within arm's reach. She turned to flee, but found the hallway gone. Not dark, not empty, gone. In its place stretched a corridor she did not know longer than the house should have allowed. Its edges soft, wet, breathing. She turned back to the nursery, but the door had sealed behind her. Flesh now, no knob, no frame, just a wall that pulsed. She pressed her palms against it and screamed. On the other side, she heard her name whispered back, not from Thomas, not from Ruth, from many voices layered together, including her own. Come back inside. The walls tightened. Abigail spun and ran down the new corridor, heart pounding, breath shallow. The air grew thicker with every step, the humming louder. The floor beneath her feet turned from wood to something damp and fibrous. The paintings on the walls blinked. She did not stop. At the end of the hallway, a door stood waiting. She recognized it. The cellar, the one they'd nailed shut years ago. Her fingers trembled as she pried at the boards. Behind her, something crawled. Soft limbs, wet breath. No footsteps, just the sound of flesh dragging across wood that was no longer wood. The final board snapped. The door swung open. Darkness, cold, stillness. She stepped inside and shut it behind her. The humming vanished. Silence returned, sharp and aching. Abigail collapsed to her knees. For the first time in weeks, she felt the ground beneath her still. But something else was here. A bundle, small, wrapped in cloth and tied with red thread. It moved, just once. Then whispered, "Mother!" Abigail screamed and struck it with her lantern. The glass shattered. Flames rose, not orange-white. A scream echoed from the floor above. Ruth's voice, shrill and cracking. Abigail stood, covered in soot and milk, and whispered, "You were never mine." Then she kicked open the cellar door. The house had begun to shake, and it was not because it feared burning. It was because it remembered birth. By morning, the house had fallen silent, not the uneasy hush it once carried, but the final kind, the stillness that comes after something has fed and either died or grown beyond needing you. Smoke drifted through the sycamores, thin and sweet, curling like fingers through the leaves. The cradle was ash. The nursery floor split wide like a wound, edges blackened, center hollow. Whatever had lived there was gone, or moved. Abigail stood in the ruins barefoot, her dress scorched and damp, her palms still stinging from the white fire. Thomas was nowhere. She hadn't seen him since the voice in the cellar had whispered father. She didn't look for him. Some things are better left missing. Ruth's room was empty, bed untouched, the walls scraped with fingernail marks that read like tally marks too many to count. The mirror had shattered completely this time. No face stared back, not hers, not anyone's. Downstairs, the walls had begun to peel. Beneath the wallpaper, hair, long, dark, human, growing straight from the grain of the wood, twitching gently in the breeze. Abigail did not cry. She walked the house slowly, placing her hand on each doorway, each windowsill, whispering the names of the ones who had almost been. She burned salt in every room, though she knew it would not matter. This wasn't a haunting. It had never been a haunting. It was a becoming. At dusk, she stepped outside. The air felt heavier, but clearer. The sycamores no longer leaned. They stood straight now, their bark damp and pale. In the yard, a second trail had appeared, small footprints, pressed deep into the earth, circling the house 3 times before vanishing at the well. She followed them. At the edge of the stones, she found Ruth's shawl dry, unstained, neatly folded. Abigail picked it up and held it to her chest. The fabric was warm. Behind her, the house let out a groan, low, tired, like a breath held too long. She turned once more. In the upstairs window, a figure stood, not Ruth, not Thomas. A woman in white, holding a bundle wrapped in red thread, her face smooth and blank, like clay not yet given features. She was humming, the same lullaby, but this time Abigail did not enter. She walked, past the trees, past the trail, until the air grew thin and the sky opened above her. She never told the town what she saw. She never returned. Years later, when the house finally collapsed, no bodies were found. But beneath the nursery floor, they uncovered 7 tiny cradles, some full, some empty, all warm. They say one twin still walks the hollow, dressed in a shawl that never fades, humming a song that has no end. The other, The other is waiting in a place deeper than grave or dream, a place where names grow roots, and once they take hold, they never let go. Comment the oldest town in your country, and if you want more stories that whisper long after the screen goes dark, like and subscribe to The Black Chapter.